Right, you should be host now, Charlotte.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. So welcome everybody. Nice to meet you all. My name's Charlotte Bowles-Lewis and I was a conservation officer for Gloucester City Council for 14 years, leading on some of their major regeneration projects. I was previously an archaeologist, so got that below ground experience when I first started working out, but decided I was more interested in upstanding buildings. That sort of took my fascination. So I went off and did a master's and here we are. But today I have my own heritage consultancy after leaving local authority. So I now give advice to people purchasing properties, developers, and also advising on applications, working with local authorities as a consultant on sort of ad hoc basis, depending on what requirements are needed. But today I'm just going to have a sort of bit of a chat through really looking at what a listed building is, what the common myths are, looking at some of the sort of what is a repair, what's an alteration, because I know that can be quite confusing to people, and also a little bit about energy efficiency as well at the end. And hopefully we can have a good discussion over some of the contents, but I will share my presentation. Hopefully you can all see that. Yeah, brilliant. Just change my settings. Right, so yeah, that's the sort of contents of the day. So we'll be running through the list and then I'll start off with just talking about what a listed building is. So a listed building is identified as one being of special architectural or historic interest. It's included on a national register of buildings and that's compiled by Historic England and it's managed under the Planning and Listed Buildings and Conservations Act 1990. So it can be a building or a structure. It's protected obviously under planning laws and also listed building laws. And there could be all sorts of structures. So it could be a telephone box or a letterbox. It could be walls, gates, structures which are monuments, not necessarily lived in dwellings. And I've put a picture up there. This is of Sissinghurst, the tower, which is Grade 1 listed and dating from the 1560s. In terms of grading, so there's 3 grades of historic buildings. So firstly, Grade 2 buildings. This makes up over 90% of the historic building stock, and they're categorised as being of special interest. And then we have Grade 2 star buildings, which is a very small minority across the country. So that's only 5.8% of the building stock. And these are categorised as more than special interest. And then Grade 1 buildings, these are of exceptional interest. And again, only 2.5% of listed buildings are Grade 1. And I've put a couple of examples up showing the different types of designations. So the first one you might recognise. So this is Westbury on 7. That's a Grade 1 listed tower. That dates from the 13th century. And that one is constructed with sort of rubble walls and it's got a shingle spire. It's one which has been scaffolded for quite some time because they had to put a new roof on there. And I know that there was quite a lot of funding issues and because it was quite an expensive project, but that's just been completed. And if you're interested, you can always pop over and go up into the spire on certain days when the church is open. So the second building is Grade 2, and this is Covenant House, which is the stone building. This is a building in Chipping Camden, previously a vicarage, and this one dates back to the 16th century with later additions and has a large Georgian extension on there. So it was partially had a Gothic wing on one side that was put up in 1847 and then later demolished 100 years later. And then the final one, I don't know, some of you might recognise, so that is the Folk Museum in Gloucester. That's a Grade 2 star timber frame building, which operates as a museum. It's owned now by Gloucester Civic Trust, and they're working as a preservation trust to reuse the site and have it open up to visitors. And that one dates from 1645. So I think, as you can see, there's quite a variety of historic buildings of all different categories and ages. Things also include Gloucester Cathedral, which could grade 1 listed, or could be a Victorian terrace, which is grade 2 listed. How do we decide what special interest is? Well, buildings are listed under a number of categories, and those start off as age and rarity. So pretty much most buildings built before 1700 or between 1700 and 1840, generally listed. Architectural interest, so that is their design, decoration, craftsmanship, or it could be particular building types or techniques, or it could be buildings which have significant plan form, so that's layout that comes together. Historic interest, again, that looks at illustrations of more important aspects, so that could be social, economic, cultural, or military history. Historical association could be related to an important person or a significant event that has happened. And finally, group value. So this is where you might have a complex of buildings that comprise an important architectural or historic group, or are a fine example of planning. So that could be a square or terrace or model villages. And generally, it tends to be that buildings are less than 30 years old are only listed if they are of outstanding quality or under threat. So a couple of common myths for you. I think I'd be a millionaire with the amount of people that tell me that only the front of a property is listed, but actually listed building status applies to the whole building. And this refers to the front, the rear, and the inside, as well as any object which is within its curtilage or structure. So an object could be a particular statue or fountain, or a curtilage building, could be an outbuilding, or an ice house, for example, which sits in the plot and has done so since before 1948. So in general, any pre-1948 structure that formed part of the land and was in the curtilage of the principal listed building at the date of listing and is ancillary to the principal building is considered to be part of the listing. There is some legal uncertainty in relation to buildings listed pre-1969, and it may be that the key date in relation to such structures is the 1st of January 1969, and that's an anomaly which Historic England generally would look at when they're reviewing listed structures. As of 2013, if you have a new list entry or a newly updated listed building, Historic England will exclude buildings from their list description. So they will specifically state whether a building is under curtilage or not. The courts have considered the precise extent of curtilage on many occasions, and determining the exact curtilage of any building is quite a complex question. Much does depend on the facts of individual cases, and there are a couple of primary considerations that are taken into account. So one is the physical layout of the building, one is the ownership, both past and present, and also the function of the buildings and spaces, past and present. So for some sites, curtilage will be very clear. A typical house in a garden will be defined by its boundary walling, and that provides its curtilage. But not every building has a curtilage. A town centre building that's never had any outside space could have no curtilage. The curtilage of some buildings may be in separate ownership, such as a country house and a stable block that's been converted into residential dwellings. The stable block may still be considered to be within the curtilage of a country house for the listing purposes. But it is important to establish what is listed, as failure to comply to listed building consent when dealing with curtilage structures can cause problems. And Historic England do have specific advice notes for listed buildings and curtilage, which gives hypothetical examples of how to assess the extent of the curtilage of a listed building. I would generally say always speak to the conservation officer if you're trying to determine curtilage, or Historic England do offer services where they'll come out and reassess your listed building description for a fee. So listed building descriptions, again, another common myth is it's not mentioned on the listing description. So listed building descriptions, they were only generally identified as a mechanism of describing the building. So most surveys that were done when buildings were listed in the 1950s were done by drive-by viewings. And this is why we've ended up with most listed building descriptions just describing the front. So most descriptions include the list entry number, the date the building was listed, and information about its location. The list entry includes a description of each building, some but not all important features, and every building, say, is listed, includes the interior and potentially any later alterations or additions unless specifically excluded in the listing. This generally comes about with more modern listings where things will be pointed out where they are excluded. As I've already said, even if a feature, internal or external, isn't included in the description, it doesn't mean that it's not of interest, and it is still part of the listed building description. Again, Historic England can update your listing building descriptions and include items that may or may not be of particular special architectural or historic interest. So for example, if you've got a property that's had a 1980s extension added on, it's very likely that Historic England will include a sentence saying not of special interest in relation to the extension. Another common myth, quite often people will say it's only grade 2 listed, it's easier to modify than a grade 1 building, or that's not of significance, it's only grade 2. So it's a common myth that grade has a bearing on how special or significant it is. And legally speaking, there is no difference between grade 1, grade 2 or grade 2 star structures. So every listed building has national importance and none are more important than the others. And this is something which, when you're doing works to a listed building, you are asked to provide a heritage statement that looks at what the significance of the building is and what the works are that you're proposing to do. So those works will look at what the significance is of the aspects that you're proposing to alter, remove, demolish, and then in that case, they'll assess whether that is of particular importance to that building or whether the works are of no harm. And that's something that's considered across all 3 grades, and the heritage statement would be proportionate to the amount of work that you are delivering. In terms of sort of general myths about work that's previously been done, or if you're buying a property that's got unauthorised works, again, it comes down to there is no immunity period for listed buildings. So saying the works were done more than 5 or 10 years ago, the planners can't do anything. Yes, they can. And in terms of buying a listed building that has unauthorised works to it, you are liable to pick up any enforcement works that have been previously completed by a historic owner. If you don't own, you're saying you don't own the building or you've been instructed to do the work, then you could be prosecuted. So if you're an agent, architect or surveyor and have been doing works to a property in conjunction with an owner and you don't have listed building consent, then you are liable. And nothing will happen if I don't get the correct consent. Well, again, with unauthorised works, if these have been picked up, then yes, you can be served an enforcement notice or fined. So there is no immunity period with listed buildings. Listed building enforcement notices can be served many years later and on current owners who had no involvement when works were carried out. Unauthorised works by previous owners can be problematic, and it's always recommended before you purchase the property that you review any work in the past that has been undertaken and whether that has relevant consent. So you are liable if you buy a property that has previous works which are unauthorised to correct those or to work with the Conservation Officer to rectify. You won't be prosecuted as a new owner if you bought a property that has unauthorised works, but you are liable to rectify them, and that could be costly. So the threat of criminal prosecution only relates to those involved in the works. So that could be, to say, if you're an owner working with an agent or a builder and you've instructed the work, then they could also be liable. So when considering rectifying works, you will need to gain listed building consent for those. And wherever there's been authorised works undertaken, it's always best to have a conversation with the local authority planning officer and conservation officer in terms of how you can rectify. Normally where they are historic works, particularly if you are a new owner, so for example, plastic windows have been put in 10 years ago and timber windows were lost, you might be able to have that conversation and say, okay, over the next 3 years, I'm going to look at replacing those windows. And that's something which you can do as a conversation and a negotiation in general. Slightly more difficult if it's works you've done yourselves. Another common myth is only old buildings are listed. And actually, whilst the vast majority of listed buildings in the UK are built before the 19th century, more recent properties and structures can gain listed status if they're of significant but national interest, or perhaps has an association with an event or person. And anybody can request for a building to be listed, and there's a form to fill in on the Historic England website. And I've just got a couple of examples of listed buildings. I don't know if it's quite my style or yours, but this is an example of China Wharf that was built in 1983. So this is a residential development that was developed by a post-modernist architect, Wilkinson and Gough. And the reasons for designations, this is now grade 2 listed. So it's an example of postmodern architecture in Britain, which combines extrovert geometry and considered contextual references. So that's the bold riverfront of the Baroque curves responding to the scale of the Thames, and landward elevations allude to 19th century warehouses. So they've also got the use of angle glazing to make optimum use of floor space, and most apartments have a river view. So the historic interest, it's an early example of a regeneration scheme in London Docklands, which leads to architecturally ambitious schemes, and they also associated it group value with the attached listed warehouses. And another example, this is the National Gallery and the Salisbury Wing. So this is dating from 1991, and this building was listed in 2018. So the National Gallery extension was designed in 1985 and was built between 1988 and 1991. And this is by Shepherd Robinson's Architects. So again, they've talked about the architectural interest designed as an extension to the Grade 1 gallery, looks at early Renaissance designs, but has been delivered in a modern style. It's highly individual, achieving a balance of old and new, and the lack of alteration and legibility of the overarching concept was a very key justification for listing. And they've also noted, again, group value with the Grade 1 listed building attached, and also a property called Canada House, which is next to it within Trafalgar Square. So it just proves that there are examples of other things that can be listed of more recent times. And finally, another myth, once listed, A building can never be delisted. This is quite a tricky one and very difficult to get buildings delisted, but it does generally only happen if it can be demonstrated that the building shouldn't, one, never been listed in the first place, or two, there has been substantial changes that results that the building is no longer being deemed worthy of listing. And personally, I've only been involved in one delisting, and this is the structure, you might know it. This is Baker's Quay in Gloucester, and historically there was a fire in Provender Mill, which happened, and it was beyond salvage, unfortunately, and it ended up having to be demolished and a new structure being put into place. So it was at that point, now the new structure has been built by the developer, they can apply for the property to be listed, and that's going through at the moment with Historic England. Talking about what works don't require consent. So there is actually quite a list of things that you can do to your listed building without having to go to the conservation officer and ask for consent or putting an application. So maintenance works are quite a key area, and general or minor repairs would not usually require consent. Like-for-like repairs, often a difficult term because people ask what is like for like. So generally like-for-like repairs relate to if you are doing works that follow the form of the historic building and are putting back like-for-like aspects. So that could be lime mortar repointing, it could be repairing some natural slates on your roof because there's a hole or water ingress coming in, lead work repairs. All of those sorts of things are considered to be a like-for-like repair. But generally, all repairs should be carried out using traditional materials, and the scope of repair is defined as work beyond the scope of maintenance to remedy defect caused by decay, damage or use, including minor adaptation to achieve a sustainable outcome, but not involving alteration or restoration. And that's determined by Conservation Principles document. So repairs are carried out to sustain the significance of the building, and it's important that how the building's repaired follows that conservation guidance and materials. So the objective is for the repair to reduce long-term deterioration, and this in turn sustains the significance of the building. But you need to understand the impacts of the works and the proposed repairs that you are doing. And repairs are very minimum that you're carrying out. So it's only ever small areas, no unnecessary replacement of historic fabric, and do not involve removal of historic material or changes to its character. Things like repainting or redecoration, both of those can be carried out. Replacement of kitchen fittings. So if you've got an existing kitchen, it's not changing its location, but you're providing an upgrade, then that can be completed. Internal painting and redecorating. External painting in the same colour can be done. The same for rewiring or plumbing following existing routes. So all of those works can be done without listed building consent. If you're installing a new bathroom in the same location, again, this can be completed without listed building consent. The same with addition of secondary glazing or draft proofing, as well as repairs, so reputtying historic windows or splicing in new repairs. All of those would be considered as works that don't require listed building consent. But I always say, if in doubt, do talk to the conservation officer. So when is a repair an alteration? So an alteration which makes a material change to the character or appearance of a listed building requires listed building consent. So this could range from a significant alteration to the building to changing a small window or blocking off a chimney stack, or if internal features are of note, the removal of such a feature or alteration. Listed building consent will be required for alterations, so that's including partial demolition and extensions, demolition, repairs to historic fabric that do not match the existing exactly, and repairs on a like-for-like basis that require extensive removal of historic fabric. So list of building consents required for internal alterations, external alterations. It could be that you're looking at taking out internal partitioning. You could be completely reconfiguring the spatial character, so putting in en suites, changing locations of kitchens and bathrooms. You could be demolishing a rear extension or adding an extension. So there's lots of areas that could come under where you're altering a listed building and you would need to put an application in. Oh, sorry, going too far. Maintenance is quite a key area when you're looking after your listed building, and that's described as a routine works necessary to keep the fabric of place in good order. So the main objective of maintenance is to limit deterioration. So inspections carried out at regular intervals, coupled with prompt action to preempt or remedy problems, are the basis of effective maintenance. And maintenance is cost effective, so the time and money spent on routine care, minor repairs, protects the value of the building and also helps ensure the health and safety of the building users and the general public. I know people often see maintenance as a bit mundane, but actually it does form the cornerstone of building conservation. And I've just put up, that doesn't come out too well, but that's a maintenance checklist there. And generally, I think some of the sort of key things that I would say to look at are block gutters, moss on roofs, block drains and downpipes. Always make sure that you don't have too much vegetation against walls, so ivy growing up. Ensure that you've got appropriate breathable paint. Don't have any blocked floor vents to cause rotten floors, and also make sure that your loft is well ventilated, and also any missing roof tiles or cracked slates are always repaired quite quickly. And once your building envelope is tight, you'll find that that does limit any problems that are likely to happen. Emergency works. So in terms of looking at emergency works, so that could be storm damage, as has happened recently, or structural damage. These works can be carried out without having listed building consent in place prior to you completing that work. And there are 4 things that need to be satisfied. 1, the works are urgent, so that's normally come as a result of building control serving you a dangerous structure notice. It could be that it wasn't practical to secure the building by works of repair or temporary supports. The work was required as a minimum measure immediately, and you do notify the local authority and the conservation officer prior to works commencing. You do still need to put in a retrospective application, and that would be required. And I would always recommend, it's important that you've had specialist advice and reports, and you've also got images to demonstrate the condition of the building prior to works commencing. So there's a record of what the structure was like, why the works had to be taken place, and you can prove what works have been done. So finally, talking about energy efficiency upgrading. I think most people think that older houses are not generally energy efficient and must be radically upgraded in order to improve their performance. But actually, in reality, it's quite complicated, and it isn't just about performance and assumptions. I think the energy and carbon performance of old houses can be improved, but you have to strike that right balance. And actually, if you get it wrong, then that does result in damaging the historic building and its fabric, and potentially could harm your health. And that's certainly the case that you might have seen with some of the reports lately about building that's had insulation put on, and they've turned into being quite mouldy internally due to the fact that they haven't been able to breathe properly. I would say adopt a whole house approach, and that's one that uses an understanding of the building in its context to find a balance of solutions that save energy, sustain heritage significance, and maintain a comfortable and healthy indoor environment. A whole building approach looks at environmental, cultural, community and economic issues, including energy supply. But we have to make sure that measures are suitable, proportionate, timely, well integrated, properly coordinated, effective and sustainable. And I think there's a number of risks, as I've said, with unintended consequences. Generally, there's opportunities and constraints depending on the context, and the optimum solution is one which might be, works in one case, certainly might not be replicated in another. So it's a very site-specific approach that's needed, and that's one that considers the relationship between building and fabric, engineering services and people. So it's always recommended you assess the whole property, taking into account how it was built before deciding on the most suitable package of energy efficiency measures, and consider what standard of energy efficiency you want to achieve and over what time period. Things you need to think about is the condition of your property, its orientation, and also the level of exposure to elements. And that does make quite a difference depending on where your property is located. Other things to think about is payback, ease of installation, impact on historic character, compatibility with its construction. So most modern buildings depend on impermeable barriers to control movement of moisture and air through the building. But in contrast, traditional building forms construction take up moisture from their surroundings and release it according to environmental conditions. Buildings of traditional construction also tend to have greater thermal inertia. They heat up and cool down more slowly, and they have an ability to buffer moisture and heat, which helps out fluctuations in humidity and temperature. Therefore, when you're planning any energy efficiency improvements, it's important to understand the way the building's performing before you undertake any works. So I think the house location and orientation will be affected by your local climate and its exposure to wind, rain and sun, as well as the form and design of the house, its construction components and its condition. What existing services you have, whether it's heating, cooling, lighting and ventilation, as well as cooking equipment, and how the property is used with entertaining. And we all use our houses differently with the amount of energy that we use, the numbers of people in your house, how much washing is done, how that washing dries. I think we've talked about principles, no one size fits all for making savings. And definitely not every success can be achieved by technical means alone. Everyone in their home needs to be fully involved in your energy saving plan. So just a couple of quick fixes here will make all of the difference. So in terms of changes how you use your home, carrying out basic maintenance, as I've already mentioned. So if you've got a faulty gutter or high ground levels, this can lead to damp in your walls, and that will lead to reducing their energy efficiency. Certainly stopping drafts, looking at increasing roof insulation at ceiling heights, upgrading heating controls. And some things can be done quite quickly and quite easily, but other things you might want to think about how those works are planned. So it could be if in 5 years' time you need to replace your roof, then is the time to think about additional roofing insulation, and it's a good opportunity to take a look at some of those longer term plans and where you can make those improvements. Drafts account for 15 to 20% of all heat loss in old buildings, so that can come from windows, doors, loft hatches, suspended floors, pipe work outside, chimneys, fireplaces. So that's quite a quick, easy fix to start thinking about, but you do need to be careful because actually a traditional building does work on ventilation. So when you then completely seal your property up, you then also have an increase of moisture. So again, you need to sort of have that balance and think about what works you can do at what time. Again, there's another couple of examples here with heating. So insulating hot water tanks and pipe work, lowering your thermostat by a degree. Think about having a constant temperature. and turning off lights when they're not in use, and fit energy saving light bulbs. Windows, I know, is quite a contentious aspect, and is probably the thing that people think is the easiest to do in terms of replacing windows, but actually wood's been used for hundreds of years. It's natural, renewable material, and certainly has a major benefit over replacing windows in terms of already their carbon energy that they have in there. And also, if you're looking at creating new windows, you need to think about where that's come from, how sustainable it is, and what actually the payback period is. Historic England have said that the loss of traditional windows from older properties poses one of the major threats to our heritage, and replacement windows have become a greater threat than ever before to the character of historic buildings and areas. Lots of questions as conservation officer about people wanting to replace windows for plastic. Generally, they see them as a quick fix because they're of greater thermal efficiency. But when you then work out the fact that they can't be recycled, how they're actually constructed, they use fossil fuels, they're quite toxic, so their energy and emissions do actually mean that they are not very sustainable in terms of their replacement. Whereas timber windows, naturally renewable, they're biodegradable, they're low carbon, and can be repaired, and they can last for a significant amount of time. Looking at secondary glazing, a lot of people get put off by secondary glazing generally because they say that it's not that attractive. It has actually improved over the years, and you can now get some very unintrusive secondary glazing, and it's one of the easiest ways to keep your house warm if you only have single glazed windows. It's reversible, you don't need listed building consent to put in, and it also reduces noise if you have an acoustic glass put in. So condensation's reduced through the addition of secondary glazing. And in terms of thermal performance, then actually by having secondary glazing, you can reduce your household bills by about 5 to 10%. And the chart I've put up here is from work that was done down in Cornwall as part of a Townscape Heritage Initiative. So they actually went along and they refurbished 2 or 3 different properties in different methods using standard double glazing, slim heritage glazing, single glazing, and then also adding secondary glazing. And they worked out in terms of how efficient it was, how much it cost, how long it took to pay back, and the link is at the bottom there if you want to go and have a look, because there's actually quite a lot of a wealth of information there for you to review. Research carried out by Glasgow University showed that draft stripping can reduce drafts by almost 90%, and heat can also be lost through glass itself, but actually with the use of a heavy curtain or a roller blind or shutters, then again you can reduce the amount of heat lost by more than 30%. Finally, just a quick look at sort of solar panels and other methods. Again, these are useful ways of improving your energy efficiency and could be introduced when you're thinking about replacing your roof. Need to think about consideration of historic setting, whether you're losing historic fabric or not, or could they be added to a rear extension, to a garage, or put in internal slopes where they are not prominent. So those are things that you can take a look at. Air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps, again, depends on setting, location, and you need to think about where appliances can be hidden or any routing of pipework and structures. And I've got 2 pages of links for you to peruse when you would like. So there's lots of information there from Historic England. Energy Savings Trust is on there, Sustainable Traditional Buildings Alliance, and there's also other links to SPAB, the Lime Forum, and a couple of links to looking at if you need any specialist help. Okay, so that was a very quick rattle through some discussions on listed buildings and the sorts of things that you can do, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So I think we've got some in the chat. Just have a look. Can previous owners of listed buildings be subsequently prosecuted for non-compliant work after they have moved?
So no, in terms of any enforcement notices on properties where they have left, so you as the new owner take on the issues and the previous owner would have been served the enforcement notice and prosecuted at the time. So once it's passed on, you would then not be prosecuted.
What is the significance of being locally listed?
Okay, so local listing would be one which is not of national importance. So a listed building is nationally of interest. A locally listed building would be one that would contribute to your particular town or village or area.
Is there the same rules around locally listed then?
You don't, it depends on whether the local authority would have put something called an Article 4 on the property. So that would remove any permitted development rights, but it's likely the sorts of things that with a locally listed building that they would like to try and retain are timber windows and the frontages or any boundaries, and they would be quite resistant to demolition of a locally listed building.
Okay. Oh, good one from Paula. Would removing plasterboard to expose old beams need listed building consent?
Yes, it would. And I know that sounds a bit peculiar, but there's always a question as to what you're uncovering. So the principle would be acceptable from the conservation officer side of things because you're removing modern fabric. But then the question is, you've got timber beams underneath. What state are they in? What changes do you need to make to them? Would you have to put any other insulation in there? So there's sort of other questions that would need to be answered.
What about if your property was listed in, say, the 90s and had some awful work done in the 70s? What would your listing be for the work that had done in the 70s? I mean, do you have to keep that, or could you restore it if it was, say, built in the 1800s? Would you be restoring it back to that?
I think it depends if it was a known architect or not for the 1970s. Excuse me, if it was sort of your average homeowner that's done a real botched job and put up lots of plasterboard and lino and all of those sorts of things, then yes, you know, quite happy to see those sorts of things taken out and the property put back traditionally. But if it's not often it's a known architect, but it could be that sometimes properties have been done at a particular period. So we would then say that that contributes to part of its evolution.
Right, okay. So another one, what's the position with garden redesign? Recently moved to a grade 2 listed building, no garden to speak of, all laid to grass. Would adding a terrace away from the house out of sight present any issues? And what about adding a terrace that would be attached to the house and in view?
So doing one that's laid to grass already, if it's not registered, which it doesn't sound like, it's a specific registered park or garden. If it's just a domestic garden within the curtilage of a listed building, then yes, you can undertake redesigns of borders. You can put in anything like that. In terms of adding structures, then potentially you need planning permission, depending on the size, or listed building consent, again, depending on the works. I'd say adding a terrace to the front probably would be more likely to need listed building consent, just generally because of that change to the character and interest. So that's where it changes.
Yeah. Okay, another one. If you feel there's been a breakdown in the relationship with your conservation officer, can you request that another one be appointed? Or someone having some arguments?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult with conservation officers. Some local authorities only have one. So you're sort of, you know, if you've had that problem, you might be stuck with them. In terms of having another conservation officer, I think it might be best to talk to the planning officer and the conservation officer together and maybe have a chat to try and work around what some of those issues are. And by having that other person there can help, I think, sometimes to act as that sort of mediation to come through. But if you are as well also having a particular problem, appoint a good heritage specialist, because they can also help and perhaps maybe take you out of the equation, and you have that conversation, they have that conversation with the conservation officer instead.
Yeah. Okay. Why do changes to boundary fencing and sheds, etc., in the grounds of the listed building need planning consent, but not listed building consent?
So that comes down to part of the permitted development rights. So where you've got listed buildings, planning permission or permitted development will be taken away. So I can't think, it's sort of, I think it's any structure over 1.8 metres for boundaries that then need to have planning permission. And usually changes to boundary treatments and sheds would not alter or harm the historic interest or architectural interest of the listed building. If they're attached, then that's different, because it would need listed building consent, but where they're placed within the garden, they wouldn't.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. Gosh, you're a popular lady. Got lots of questions.
Yeah.
Is there any advice around how to treat exposed beams directly above a shower unit in a bathroom, and generally treating beams which have historic evidence of woodworm or beetle but no current activity? Presume all of this counts as maintenance.
Yeah, so you can have a chat with sort of timber specialists about undertaking treatments for woodworm, death watch, beetle. I don't know if that person's had a particular report when they bought the property. But if they do have that, then yeah, you normally get a guarantee with how long of its lifespan that it's lasted, but it would be treated as maintenance doing those works. I think it's quite difficult treating exposed beams where you've got certainly lots of moisture and things, because you don't want to seal them up. So generally you end up sort of leaving them natural as best as possible in terms of that answer.
Okay. So one from Nathan: can weak lath and plaster ceilings be overboarded so that the fabric underneath is retained, or would listed building consent be required?
So listed building consent would be required because you're making an alteration by overboarding. It's quite a tricky one with lath and plaster ceilings, as to, it depends on how fragile they are, I suppose. If they're at risk of properly failing and falling down, then yes, it might be the case the conservation officer agrees that you are then protecting fabric, or it could be that they say cut out an area that is particularly vulnerable and put up some new lath and plaster. But yeah, listed building consent would be required for that work.
Yeah. Are there any additional requirements or restrictions if a listed building is in a conservation area?
No, so listed building trumps a conservation area in effect. And actually, even if you are in a conservation area, there's very limited restrictions, unless, as I say, your property's got an Article 4 directive on there and permitted development rights have been removed. So if you're a single homeowner and your property is completely residential and you've got lovely timber windows, they could be ripped out and plastic put in and no one could do anything about it. So conservation areas, unfortunately, don't necessarily mean that much in terms of restrictions.
Right. Steve has asked, how can you find out the original layout of your property and the spec of a listed property in order to ascertain what, if any, internal works have been done?
So you can look at planning records. So most local authorities have a case file on your listed building, and you can go through and see what alterations have been done over time. Something called the planning portal that you can have a look at and put the property reference in. Or you can also go to the archives, and sometimes you can find plans of the historic building, and again, applications that have come in or changes that have been made. And that's quite a nice way of sometimes finding detailed drawings and specs of your historic building.
Okay. Steve has asked, does tanking a property need permission? I'm not sure we'd advise tanking a solid wall property.
It definitely needs permission. Yes, it would need listed building consent.
Yeah, not sure you'd get it, but
no, I'm not sure you would get it.
Unfortunately, tanking doesn't really work with a solid wall property because it doesn't allow those walls to breathe. there may well be difference if it's a basement or something, but it's certainly not something we'd recommend.
No, I've only ever permitted it in properties that have basements, and they have been particularly prone to flooding.
Yeah,
that's the only time it has been. So it does depend on the situation, but you would need listed building consent.
Yeah. We have cement render on the back of our house, which is failing. Ideally, we'd like to replace the whole lot with some lime render, but it would be much cheaper to repair patches. Would we need listed building consent either to re-render completely or to patch up the render?
So where you're using cement, you can do patching, and I know it's not great, but if you've just got small areas, then yes, you can do that work under a repair. Generally, we would advise that you would hack it all off and put lime render back on, mainly because that will mitigate longer term issues, and you would need listed building consent, but that would be something which the conservation officer would encourage you to do, and it wouldn't be a particularly difficult application to submit.
Great. Well, I think, oh no, a few more.
I was going to say, I did spot one in the list about insulating under floorboards for acoustic.
Oh, I missed one. Okay, yeah.
Or will this hinder the breathability of the house? I think you can insulate under floorboards. Historic England's got some really good guidance on insulating at varying levels, floor and ceiling. You can use wood wall boards, there's lime plaster, there's different methods of doing it, so you shouldn't hinder any breathability.
Can new telecoms cables be strung across the front of a listed property between the poles on the boundary?
So telecoms is quite a tricky one with listed buildings. Normally it needs consent, so any aerial cable fixing that would require an application. If you're stringing things between poles and you're not physically attaching anything to a listed building, then unfortunately there's not a lot that we can do about it. But if it's physically being attached, then yes, you would need listed building consent for that work.
Okay. And Steve's asked, what about plasterboard covering solid walls internally?
So yes, again, that would need listed building consent and wouldn't be something that we would recommend. It depends what you're doing it for. It's always difficult answering these questions because you never know what the reason is. But
so if you're plasterboarding, you just have to be careful that the wall's still breathing behind it. Otherwise, you're still just trapping that moisture, and you're just hiding the issues essentially. So if you've got damp, you might not see it for a few years, but plasterboard essentially is made from gypsum. So once it's even just a tiny bit wet, it will really struggle to dry out again. So your damp will just come back and you'll have these little condensation patches all over again. So it would be better if you can to remove any gypsum and get it lime plastered so that your walls can breathe, ideally. Well, I think we've come to the end. If anyone does think of any other questions, just drop me an email and I can ask Charlotte. We'll send the slides across to you as well, and I'll also upload them to the download page on our website. Hopefully you found it all useful and answered some of your questions. But as I said, if you've got any more questions, then do send them over. So thank you everyone for coming. Do keep an eye on the website as well, because we will be running some more online events in the coming months, but I will drop you an email about that. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Hopefully it's not raining where you are.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for everything. Appreciate it.
No worries.
Oh, sorry, just one more. Sorry to be that person. I messaged somebody privately accidentally. I thought I put it on the group. The previous owner concreted our dining room floor. Do I need to apply for consent to sort of have it looked at? Because there's loads of damp surrounding all of the walls in the dining room. Obviously, we don't know where the damp's coming from, but I'd imagine the concrete's not particularly good as it holds the moisture, doesn't it?
Yeah, so the concrete will end up being seeping up into your walls. So generally, in terms of removing it, listed building consent would be needed to put in a limecrete floor or alternative, but there wouldn't be any issues in terms of getting that consent. It would just be the question of what you do in terms of remedying that problem. But Kate's probably better placed to advise in terms of sort of remedies of how to do that. But I'd have a chat with the local authority.
We would generally say a concrete floor is the last thing that you need to worry about, because it's quite a big, expensive job to get it up. You need to make sure that everything else in your house is working properly before worrying about the floor. So there's a few things you can check. Your external ground level should be about 6 to 8 inches lower than your internal. So then any moisture that is getting in from outside or inside has got a chance to evaporate before it gets to your internal walls and your floor. Have a look outside. There's cement render or pointing. If there is, then that could be drawing any moisture in, particularly if there's any cracks, and hairline cracks are probably the worst, actually, because the capillary action really pulls that moisture in, and then it will get trapped in your walls. And then internally, you can have a look at see if there's any. Sometimes you might have a cement internally, and then it's gypsum plastered over as well, which isn't ideal, or tanking. So have a look at your walls to start with before worrying about your floor, I would say.
Yeah, there is. It looks like there's a spread of gypsum plaster up the walls. I did notice that. Would I be able to chip away a little bits of that, or would I need to again apply for consent?
Depends on how much you're taking off. If you're completely redoing a whole room or whole property, then yes, you would need consent. But if you just want to do a bit of investigation to work out what you've got, then no, you wouldn't need consent for doing that. I sort of call it opening up works, where you'd sort of chip a little, meter section away and just have a look at what's going on and work out how to replace it.
Okay, wicked. Yeah, so also now the two biggest concerns I had. So yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
It's okay.
No worries. Thanks
Thank
for coming.
you for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Cool.
Oh,
That went good. Well done. It's very interesting. I think there's a lot of questions, so they must have done.
I was going to say that's
always good.
Always nice to have lots of questions.
Yeah. Real.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you can send me the PDF, and then I can send it around to people that weren't there, or I imagine all those lot want it as well. And then we'll do the next one. Can't remember when we booked it. April, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was sort of end of April time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll just do the same thing, and then
great. And yes, get your invoice sent over, and I'll get it paid straight away.
Yeah, brilliant. We'll do. Thank you for that. No, it's been good actually. It's been quite nice putting stuff together. I never know how. I was sort of a bit, have I pitched it too low or not? Because you never know what the types of people that are coming. But I just sort of, yeah, it's
always difficult. We get the same with ours. We've been doing some talks just on damp, and some people just literally know nothing. They just know that their houses are wet, and then there's other people that have been doing lots of googling, but they always find, even if they think they know lots, they tend to not actually know as much as what they think they know sometimes. So and they always ask questions, so then they get what they need. So
yeah, which is fair enough. No, it was good. Very enjoyable.
Real. Lovely. Well, I will talk to you soon.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.